Welcome and thank you all for joining us today on this Friday of Fridays for the second Humanities Without Walls presentation on the topic of collaborative, reciprocal, and redistributive methods of research. Regulars to the Humanities Research Institute and the Humanities Without Walls events will have noticed that I am not HRI Director and HWWPI Antoinette Burton. This is a reality I am disappointed by regularly. I am, in fact, Jenny Davis, from the Departments of Anthropology and American Indian Studies here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I'm grateful to be working with Antoinette and the entire HWW team this year around the theme of redistribution and reciprocity. As many of you hopefully already know, the third round of the Mellon's Humanities Without Walls initiative is not unified under a specific theme, at least as the last two were, but is instead organized around two ethical and methodological principles, reciprocity and redistribution. And to that end, throughout this academic year, we are organizing a series of presentations around these principles. Today, we're very lucky to be hearing from and learning with two scholars and practitioners who take up these practices robustly and have for quite a long time. For more information around this round of HWW's Ground Research Challenge, as well as the recordings of the information session and first presentation in this series, please follow the link in the chat. Hello? And because we are Zooming from Urbana-Champaign, we at HWW and UIUC acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, the Piankashaw, the Wea, the Miami, the Mascoutin, the Ottawa, the Sauk, the Meskwaki, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Chickasaw nations. These nations were forcefully removed from their traditional territories, and these lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As part of a land grant institution, we have a particular obligation to recognize the peoples of these lands and the histories of dispossession upon which the university rests. As humanists, we also recognize that the past is not the past, and that no field or arena of inquiry is exempt from the responsibility of addressing the legacies of settler colonialism and its contemporary manifestations well beyond acknowledgements such as this. Thus, this statement is also a demonstration of our ongoing commitment to supporting the work of Indigenous scholars and communities so that we together are able to envision what poet Joey Harjo calls a map to the next world. If you would like more information about the land acknowledgement, what the land acknowledgement statement is, how it fits into larger initiatives on campus, or what our individual and collective next steps might be, join us for the annual HRI work-in on December 1st, and that link is also in the chat. As a background, the layout for today will be presentations by Dr. Ruby Mendenhall, followed by a question and answer period, and then a presentation from Dr. Korinta Maldonado, also followed by a question and answer period. And you're welcome to submit questions at any time in the chat, and we'll be adding them towards the end. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Ruby Mendenhall is an associate professor in sociology, African American studies, urban and regional planning, and social work here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is also an affiliate of the Institute for Genomic Biology and the Institute for Computing and Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, as well as the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Democratization of Health Innovation at Carle-Illinois College of Medicine. As you might guess from her many affiliations, her work makes critical interventions across many fields within the humanities, social, computational, and medical sciences. Her research focuses on issues of social inequality over the life course and the role of public policy and individuals' agency in facilitating social and economic mobility. She uses quantitative and qualitative methods to analyze administrative welfare and employment data, census data, in-depth interviews, and focus group data. And if you have been following any of the events on campus, you'll know that her work is creating really important conversations around longstanding issues and contemporary moments like the university COVID course and many others. So please join me in welcoming Ruby today for her presentation.
Everyone, thank you very much, Jenny, Antoinette, for asking me to come and talk about my research. And it'll be interesting because it won't be a kind of straight line story, but hopefully you can get a sense of where I started and where I'm going. And I apologize for the sun. It's streaming in on this fall day. And so I'm going to share my screen to thank the essential workers for allowing us to remain safe in many ways. And just again, Dr. King's quote about all labor has dignity, and hopefully when this is over, or even during the process, we can recognize that dignity would increase pay. And just a few points, I'll talk about my story, my method, some of the ethics that came up, and then you'll see this kind of long list of research that I do. But again, hopefully you'll see how it's all related. I know sometimes it feels like it's not related to others. It's related in my head. And so then in terms of my story, I start many of my talks talking about that I am the descendant of an enslaved human in this country, of many enslaved humans, and how my great aunt, who's here with the hat on, she took care of her grandmother when she was younger, and her grandmother was a former slave. And so I always use her to say that it was only one person between my enslaved great-great-grandmother and myself who could tell the stories, and that's how recent it is in US history, and as we struggle to kind of overcome different levels and types of oppression. And then also here is my grandmother, who was at an event with Dr. King, and it's also important to note that at that event there was a bomb threat, and there were many during that time, and I often wonder, like, what makes people put their lives at risk? Like, how do you do that? And so I'm even learning, right? So we don't necessarily have the bombs, but the way that things are set up, the amount of time and energy that we give different projects, in some ways it's still the sacrifice that you make to advance this democracy. And so as I think about that, I also think about the importance of understanding structural barriers, from racism to economic insecurity, healthcare, education, and understanding in the realm of health that when people may come into the doctor's office with a stroke, they may have diabetes, we're seeing high levels of Black maternal infant mortality, that's at the tip of the iceberg. And underneath it are all of these, again, structural issues that have been going on for African Americans, over 400 years of racial trauma that I think about even as we try to address these issues. And then, so in my research, I also am now kind of thinking about, so for many who don't know, I started my professional career as an occupational therapist, and I work with children from 0 to 3, and I love that job. I was at Cook County Hospital. And one of the things that led me to kind of go into public policy and to higher education was that mothers were coming in. I was on the protective service team. They couldn't afford to feed their babies, and we would look at them again structurally and say, what's wrong? Do we need to take the child? And then to hear their stories over and over again about not being able to afford it, that led me to the work that I'm doing now, but my passion was the young people. And so in some of my research, we're now looking at adverse childhood experiences. And so you'll see in this box, for 100 mothers, about 60% said that their family struggled with childhood, which is the stories that I heard when I was an occupational therapist on the protective service team. Sexually abused or molested, about 22%. 41% witnessed someone being shot as a child. And to understand what that does over the life course, and how that affects the body, how stress gets under the skin. And that's definitely one of the themes of my research. And I want to show a clip. It's always dicey, but I want to show a clip talking about this idea of children living in war zones and the effect that it has on them.
Brother Stavante is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Stavante has lost 2 of his brothers. I was over at Stefan's gravesite yesterday, where he is buried on top of his 19-year-old brother. Stavante has lost his older brother. He has lost his baby brother. And he is losing some of his mind. And while everyone has something to say, while everyone wants to talk negative, this is why this baby says we need a resource center. Where are the mental health professionals in our community? He needs help. What you see is not rare. It just had to happen this way because every single day there is a child that looks just like Stevante, who is running around here, who looks half crazy to the world, but you don't know the damage that's done inside. We are living in communities that are like war zones. You don't know what it's like to go to the home that you grew up in and feet from the couch you lay on, your brother was murdered in his grandmother's backyard. You don't know the pain that his grandfather feels from hearing him knock on the window for help. Let's take our outrage, but let's use it for something positive. He will not be another name added to a list. We are too strong. We are too united. And it is time for things to change.
So I do share that because, again, this idea of living in war zones, and I'll say even now, in terms of ethics, for me, it's really important, and I can't stress it. The importance of having individuals who are in those communities experiencing that level of trauma to tell their own stories, and I'll talk about that later too. And then here's just another image as we try to in our research, right? So when we actually write our papers, we try to create the visual image before and this one. And again, I'm grateful to the medical students to really try to bring home what it's like. And so the blue lines are showing, right, like you have your kind of basic level of stress. An acute stressor comes, it goes up, but you come down back to kind of your baseline. But for many communities of color and individuals who have high levels of stress in their communities, like the body is revved up all the time. And so how that affects health and wellness. And then the book, How Healing Works, I really am intrigued by it because it talks about how a lot of the healing that happens, it doesn't happen in the doctor's office, that it happens in individuals, their rituals, their practices, and that's the resiliency. So even as I showed the earlier picture of my grandmother and my aunt, and I think about the words that they told me, I think about the way that they moved in the world and how some of that is manifested in me. And that's, I think, how over 400 years of racial trauma, right, that we are still here to talk about it. And that's also what I try to bring into my research, this hidden aspects of resiliency, or I should say that are often hidden. And so we know about infant mortality. As I said, right, I didn't say I worked in a neonatal intensive care unit as well as an occupational therapist. So when I see these numbers, it's near and dear to my heart. And I think about prevention, right? Like how do we prevent these stats from even happening? And so that's also what I think about. And when I think about like public awareness campaigns. And here, right, we are in the midst of a pandemic, numbers over 230,000 deaths, over 9 million cases. And now we're starting to see that there are lingering effects. And so that's going to be important when I talk about, I think it's important for people to be health experts. This is what I mean. Even before COVID, I thought it was important, but even now. And Jean Robinson at the Institute for Genomic Biology, we've talked for a long time when we were doing our research in Chicago about how can we create these modules, how can we create a level of education where the women understood about stress and what it does to their body. And they already know, but kind of more the technical aspects of it. So some of my research questions over time has been, so how do, and this is from David Satcher's work that found that there are 83,000 access Black deaths a year, so more than what you would expect from old age, from diseases. And when I heard that stat, I remember I was teaching one of my social classes, and I was like, oh my goodness, like how does that happen? And they said it's the equivalent of a plane full of African Americans falling out the sky every day, every year. My question is, how does that happen? So you see the word quest, so that kind of led me on this quest about trying to understand how stress gets under the skin to negatively affect health. I had the pleasure of doing study in a second discipline. Gene Robinson was my advisor. I would go through different classes, and I would come and sit with him and say, well, what about this? Well, how is this? Why isn't it that way? What can be done? And that was also a way to kind of help me move forward with some of the things that I'm doing now. And as I said again, how do you prevent the deaths, right? We're anticipating over 400,000 deaths early next year. And I'm like, well, what can we do now where we don't have to sit and wait for this tsunami of death that's coming upon us? And then racially segregated neighborhoods with high levels of violence, how does that affect Black mothers' mental and physical health? And then also I'm doing big data research looking at how Black women talked about oppression and resiliency over time from 1740 to 2014. And part of that is to link to my life story when I wonder, I have like about 3 stories about my great-great-grandmother who was enslaved. And I wonder, right, if we had access to her voice, the other millions of people, what would we know about health and wellness now? What would we know about resiliency and how social structures stay the same and how they change? Oops. In terms of some of the methods, when we went to Inglewood, we specifically chose a women-centered space. We initially started with some food, but as we saw this high levels of food insecurity, we kind of beefed it up, right, no pun intended, into like a meal. And it's interesting, one of the women, she was experiencing domestic violence. She actually came, her lip was busted, she had a black eye. And we were like, maybe you can come back later. We're going to be here for several weeks. And she insisted. But the beauty of choosing that space was that there were counselors there who were able to talk with her, to provide her guidance, advice. And then she did come back after she talked with them and do the interview. Surveys, interviews, again, with the idea, how do I get the voice of the people who are experiencing this out? So as much as possible, I know I interpret and it comes through me, but as much as possible to get their voice out. And so you see this picture is my favorite, one of my favorite pictures in the world, because it's after we did an exhibit in Inglewood. We worked with the citizen scientists and we had the mothers talk about their own experiences. And that's what this picture captured, where she's in the foreground and I'm in the background. With the genomic analysis, we went into the community, we collected blood and we did focus groups and we asked the mothers, right, like if we were to come and say we wanted to get some blood, right, would you like, how should we talk about it? We know the history of the US, we know the exploitation, and they gave us some language, and the individuals in our research team were mostly African-American women, and we think that's part of it as well. And so also in terms of tweets and getting people's voices out, I'm now working on a project where we're looking at millions and millions of tweets around Black racial trauma, right? To say her name, Black Lives Matter, all of that, to see how people talk about it and the resiliency, and even social media as a site of resiliency. I mean, and trauma too, we're talking about that, but also resiliency. So as Jenny mentioned, I look at crime stats, police records. You'll see this image, computer scientists, students, they took some of our data on Black women, crime stats, how they sleep, right? Because the stress disrupts their sleep, and they created a virtual reality experience, and that was really cool. And so even ethically, right? Some people may feel if they experience it virtually that they have a sense of it, and I would argue that you don't, and even I don't, because it is intense and in a lot of ways that we really can't grasp if we're not embedded in that environment. So we also use sensors to understand when they hear the sounds of gunshots, how that affects them physiologically. So in ethical issues, some of the mothers talked about people thought that the sensors were from the police, and so they had to explain, no, we're doing a study, with citizen scientists and community scientists. So I'm using that term broadly. And this is some of the tools that we use. And I think there was a question about visual art. And so this image at the bottom reflects an art piece that we put together. And what it is strings, but on the other end of it are bullets. Well, they represent bullets. We had a long discussion. Should we do bullets? Many people have experienced gun violence, and we didn't want to create more trauma. So it's kind of like hinges that are on the bottom. But we put up the number of 911 calls about gunshots in Inglewood compared to Lincoln. Why am I blanking on Lincoln? Lincoln Park. I want to say Lincoln Square Mall, Lincoln Park. And so people who came in, they could visually see, it was a beautiful exhibit, but they could see the tragedy, right? Like Inglewood, higher levels, and Lincoln Park, not many at all. Just a slide about convergent science, looking for solutions. And so as many know, I'm also part of the Health Maker Lab. And we just started a new lab called Designing Resiliency and Wellbeing. At the College of Medicine, we talk about having access to a billion-dollar garage. So part of my research is looking at how can we use this billion-dollar garage to look at social determinants of health disparities, and then to have community members drive some of the discoveries that will lead to health equity. For instance, I'm really interested in reimagining food production in the home as I look at people standing in line for hours for food. What can we do where we can grow it perhaps year round? And so Timothy Stark works with industrial fabrics and greenhouses. So I'm interested in that in the Designing Resiliency Lab. Here, Community Healing and Resistance is another project that I work with where we talk to community members here in Champaign-Urbana, right? My focus was Chicago with gun violence, but the community members let us know that it's an issue here. And so we had them come together to talk about it, and then also created digital stories about community healing. Here's a picture of our treasure boxes that we filled with things that facilitate healing, and we give them to families who are affected by gun violence. And again, this sense of care that, that we're here, we see the pain, we stand with you in that pain. And then this picture is from a focus group where we had community members come and say, what does healing, community healing look like to you? What would you like to see? And one of the things that came out is they wanted a safe space for young people. And so we were glad because the STEM Illinois project was launching during that time. I'll take one more minute because my time is wrapping up. We were launching during that time and really thinking about how do we create a space that is safe for children, but also that it takes care of family members. And so what you're seeing here is our Communiversity, right? The union of community and university individuals, and we wanted it to be a beautiful space. Antoinette is on the line. That's her chair that we call the elder chair. It's a beautiful, comfortable chair. And we say when the elders in the community come and they sit there, and then we'll sit and listen and get their wisdom and resiliency. And then I'll just quickly go through others. Office hours for both community members, faculty, staff, administrators, and it's this mutual exchange of knowledge. We have a multimedia studio, again, to have young people and others as knowledge producers and putting some of that out in music that's embedded in the culture. Think and Do Tank with our webcast. We had Pamela Jolly talk about intergenerational wealth. We have a dream incubator where young people, they tell us what their dreams are. And when we have people come through, we connect them. And so coming up, we have 3 doctors who will talk about their pathway to medicine. And so we're going to work with 3 young people, 2 who are interested in medicine and have them come and talk with the physicians. We have a community and university art gallery. Jenny and her wonderful art and others are part of this. And as a way to encourage community members, faculty, anyone who would like to have their art displayed, we have a space for that at the Wellness Center. We're starting the Nobel Project for young people, but again, it's a pathway program to medicine. And we're inviting Nobel laureates. We're having the young people give TEDx talks. We want, again, them to be knowledge producers, for them to talk about their conditions and how they envision ways to make it better. We have young people engaging in community mapping and trying to address COVID-19 related issues in their neighborhood. Citizen Science Project, where individuals from all over the state of Illinois talk about COVID-19, how it's affecting them. I don't have time to read the entry, but you can see we try to get a wide range of individuals. And I think the last slide I'll just say again is, so part of my research, right, I started at Cook County. I've got a degree in public policy, then human development and public policy. That is my passion, and I'm looking to see how can we reimagine our society. And one of the people who's stunning to me is Frances Perkins, and during the Depression, all the things that she did. So I'm really studying some of how she did, what she did, and hoping to work with others to do some of this. So thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing.
All right, thank you very much for sharing that presentation and the kind of depth and breadth of your approaches to these questions. Let's see if I can, there we go. So everybody's welcome to put questions in the chat if you have them, both for Ruby, and then we'll have a chance potentially towards the end. I do have a question to kick us off. Can you talk a little bit about your process for inviting in or establishing the relationships with the community members who are your community scientists and your citizen scientists? I'm guessing maybe for one project, right? But kind of how does that relationship get started?
Yeah, so we worked with the community organizations who have kind of strong relationships with the women. But then also one thing that I think is really important is to try to do research, and when we're engaging people, to be able to reach people who aren't connected to social service agencies and others. So we stood at the bus stop and we passed out flyers. We of course went to childcare workers, like here in town, even with the Nobel Project, like I went to the soup kitchens to ensure that their children have access to this. We're trying to engage the Black farmers in Pembroke. And I went there to talk with them, and then I am socially distanced and all of that. But then as I was driving away, I saw some men at the gas station. And at first I was like, oh, okay. And then I kept going, but I turned around because I wanted to give them the flyers to ensure that their children could also have access. So I would say community organizations, of course, the churches and other things, also social media. I talked on the radio on WVON and other places, but really trying to think about when I see people, even on the corners, when I see people who may be homeless and other things, I give them the flyers. So really trying to extend who has access, who hears about the information.
So we have a question from Gilberto Rosas, who says, can you talk about how you come to your research questions?
Yeah, so I think I'll two examples. Like I said, when I was watching that documentary and when they talked about a plane full of African Americans falling out the sky every day, every year, and it was stunning, right? It was a stunning statistic to me. And then I said, well, how does that happen? What's the process? And so that really started my quest to understand what's the relationship between stress, between where you live, between discrimination, between hypervigilance, between all of this, and how does it tear up your body? And then, and not even that, then how do you let everyone know that that's what's happening? So there was one mother who, she had mold in her house. Her kid was sick, he was in the hospital. She would stay at night with him in the hospital. Her other kids were sick, so someone was staying with them. She would get up in the morning, see her kid, she would go to work, one part-time job, get on the bus, take an hour and so to get to her second job. And she was doing that, and then she fell out talking to her mother. And when I was interviewing, she was like, yeah, you know, I don't take stress well. And then I couldn't take it, right? I was like, no, anybody's body would fall apart after all of that. And so really trying to help people understand what it does to the body, but also how you can get, as we like to say, stress out from under the skin, and really paying attention to that in terms of prevention. And then another way that my research question came with the big data project is that, you know, I was teaching a methods class, and I wanted to expose social students to big data and those type of methods. And I knew that it was something that they normally wouldn't get exposure to. And so as Michael Simeone came in my class and he talked, like I would listen, I was like, oh, I wonder if I can answer this question with big data. Like, why is it possible to get at this question? So even when I proposed the question that I did about like, how did Black women talk about their lives, can we go back and recapture their stories and standpoint? It was so interesting to computer scientists. And when I go to their conferences to talk and to give keynotes, like one woman, she said, you know, I wasn't going to stay for this talk because I was just like, what would this talk have to do with my research? And she said, you know, you had the methods, but then you showed us how we could link that to social issues and how to address inequality. So those are two examples to how I came to my questions.
Great. I think we have time for at least one more question. We had one come in from Lisa Ortiz. It says, can you talk more about how you go about doing different but not disconnected work that makes sense to you, as you mentioned just a little bit ago, and that makes sense in general, but that might not be read as such by others?
Yeah. And so, and I use the term a lot, well, it makes sense in my head. It's all connected in my head. And so how do you get that connection out of your head and onto others? Good question. So I recently had to do it right as you kind of write statements about your research. But I would say, and it's over time too. So it's not like I did all of this at once. So that's one where you have a research question, you come up with something, and then you go and expand it. So this is a perfect question answer to. We co-wrote a paper called Involving Black Women in Genomic Research. And I'll send it so Jenny can send it around to others. But I think it's like 6 phases. And so we talk about phase 1, this is what we did, this is what we saw we needed. And then this was phase 2. We didn't get any funding, right? We had a big, beautiful, brilliant idea. It was holistic, right? It was big, it was chunky, but it was too big, too chunky. So then we took little pieces of that idea and then marched towards something else. So I think that's kind of one way where you have this big vision, you see the problem, and then you take chunks of it and then try to kind of create that narrative as you write research proposals, right? You write about your research. But I think that paper would be helpful. And it was helpful for me even, right? Like after you spend all this time doing so much to try to put it into a coherent story. And then the last thing I'll say is, right, when we look at all the things that are happening in society, that right there relates it, right? Because it's stunning at the complexity, it's stunning at how long inequality has been around, right? And people have tried and have resisted and have made some advancement and then have kind of gone backwards. And so I think when you look at the big picture, right, that really helps to solidify it.
Fantastic. All right, so hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for more questions towards the end, but I do want to make sure we have enough time for our second presenter. So thank you very much, Ruby. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Korinta Maldonado, who is a clinical professor in American Indians, clinical assistant professor, pardon me, in American Indian and American Languages Lab. Within the Department of Anthropology, she has developed the Engaged and Activist Research track for undergraduate and graduate students. Cora was the 2020 recipient of the J. Frederick Miller Award for Distinguished Service by a University of Illinois faculty or staff, which is given to an individual who's made significant contributions as a volunteer in the local community. This award recognizes direct public service to the campus or the local community and efforts of organizing and delivering community service. And what's really critical here is the way that this is folded in and is actually the heart of Cora's research and teaching, kind of as a thoroughfare all the way across. And I thought that the description used for that award was really incredible. So it describes Cora's work as being at the forefront of local Indigenous language activism that honors and empowers local Maya immigrants by bolstering resources for communication while also seeking to preserve and promote Indigenous knowledge, culture, and values. Her work is building bridges and promoting respect and understanding between Maya communities, school district staff, local service providers, and non-Indigenous community members. And her efforts to further accompaniment for and with Maya immigrants led to the formation of the Maya Interpreters Collective in February of 2019, a group of 7 local Maya men and women who have received a 40-hour interpretation training workshop and are being equipped to enact language justice throughout the community, who can intervene in legal proceedings in hospitals and more. So please join me in welcoming Cora.
So hi, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Jenny. That was a wonderful presentation and introduction. And I'm very happy and honored to be here, to reflect upon my practice, right? I see very much myself as a practitioner. And I'm gonna share my screen so I can. So mine is kind of a little bit different in terms of trying to map out a little bit of my trajectory, but also thinking about, how I envision my praxis, and also my methods. And one thing I depart from is conceiving my work within the framework of activist research, specifically within anthropology, but in this case, I'm kind of burning it up for the public. Which basically really thinks about, as much with other currents and disciplines, activist anthropology does not emerge in a vacuum. It draws from a range of intellectual genealogies, including feminists of color, Indigenous scholars, decolonial thinkers, inside and outside the academy. We can think about Faye Harrison, Aníbal Quijano, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, just to name a few of the many interlocutors here, as well as social movements. And they have for decades theorized about the colonial imperial logics of knowledge production and how they have intervened, and these have intervened in the debate over decolonizing knowledges, right? And although there are multiple iterations of activist anthropologists or engaged anthropologists, you kind of went through them a little bit, Jenny, last time. It's also at the core of this is an intervention with, in terms of redefining methods, right? Field methods, specifically within anthropology, field work, right? And this consistent anthropology is really, this kind of redefinition is aligning, right, ourselves within political spheres, right, and aligning ourselves with a group of people we are walking with, right, aligning ourselves with social movements, liberation projects. That's one part of it, and as well as including all within the research, including the people we're aligning ourselves with in the planning of each phase of the research process, right? From the conception of the research, conceptualization of the research, all the way to the dissemination of the result. So there's several critical propositions that underline activist anthropology. Social movements and people who engage in daily struggles are important sites of knowledge production. They are the knowledge producers, right? They are the core of the knowledge production. And we need to kind of recognize that in ways that we need to figure out how to recognize that do not create that divide between, certain scholarship and, our informant, or, and we don't use that word anymore, but many do. And then figure out how to recognize and integrate them into the research process, right? If there's an impetus or a need to or desire to, right, from the different communities. And this framework also challenges structures, hierarchical structures of from which knowledge is produced. So also just trying to break those away. And this is just, I'm just trying to kind of situate myself in terms of what I see as the core. And those are kind of also guide this my actions, right? And my praxis throughout my scholarly research, my activist research. And activist anthropology, so it's really looking to open other forms of knowledges to thrive, right? Or to give space for those, right? To really kind of decenter Western perspectives of knowledge production. And lastly, the collective knowledge productions challenge, right? Thinking about these collaborations and how to create this knowledges in collectivity, challenge the institutional structures through which knowledge is recognized and validated. So a lot of the work that I see myself doing and that I feel that I can intervene in greatly is rethinking the university, right? Rethinking what are the sites and the walls. We're talking about walls, right? How do we rethink those barriers that might at some point not allow this interaction and these collaborations to flow in the way that I personally would like to. So really is thinking about affirming the importance of empirically grounded and analytically driven work without having to compromise also kind of the rigor of theory. So that's, one of kind of the central position from where I take off. And it's really a commitment to collaborative research, a commitment to liberation struggle, the commitment to the colonial frameworks, right? And a commitment to the communities, right? Always putting them at the center of what's at stake, right? And how do we, having them at the center, communities or peoples from the communities, kind of redefine ourselves and how we move about creating our research. We have a kind of this series of different points. And also collaboration might take many different forms, right? There's not like a formula for it. That's kind of what I kind of will trace throughout the presentation. But there's many times where collaboration will fail, and many times in which collaboration is gonna, it only has certain possibilities because of the context, the historical context, the place, the resources, many different things, right? So always kind of considering that these collaborations and this, merging of brains and co-construction of knowledge is always potentially limited by many things, right? Another stance is I see research, that the richness of the research is principally the process, right, through which you go, right, and the process of coming together. And that's where I feel we can think about the most productive side of knowledge production. And lastly, which I think is very important, and I'll probably, if I have time, I'll talk at the end about it. It really recognizes and keeps in tension the unequal relationships that are embedded in the research, right? So, and the messiness that comes with it. And this is something that I always struggle in the classroom when I'm talking about collaborative research, collaborative ethnography, because there's such a way of learning, right? That those messiness are not allowed, right? That messiness is just, it just conduces to a lot of anxiety for students. And I think that's where we need to kind of pay attention to, and that's where knowledge gets produced. And also, embodying the uncomfort of those locations, right? I work with many community members, and we work together, and we put together grants, and it's very uncomfortable, and it's complicated and sometimes painful to, we have to share kind of resources and look at, this is what it's going to cost for me, for example, to take a class off, and that those amounts of money sometimes are very complicated to convey to somebody that has a very different position, right? But I take those on, and I think that's part of where I feel it's important, right? This is this is the unequal relationships, and I have to acknowledge them, and I recognize them, and I embrace them with all that might take, and the conflicts that potentially could create, or the pain that it might also convey and create. So, I mean, I emerged from that. That's kind of my framework, and that's kind of a long, and I hate kind of going back so far, but I'm just trying to think about, you know, what is, oh, sorry, I went ahead of myself. But one of the things that I wanted to convey also, it was that it makes collaborative and activist anthropology and activist research is to think about what is not, right? To make it a little bit clearer, because it's kind of in the gray zone here. One is not a way of, it's not trying to make our research understandable to the public, which it's important, but I'm just trying to, and it's critical for everybody, but that's not what I'm referring to. It's not jointly collecting data either. And I also partake on those practices, but ideally, I think it conveys more than that. It's not a consultation with communities or with your collaborator, right? Although those are important as well. And it's not service work or outreach, because I think it tends to be, we tend to see things with particular languages that are just referring to the way we have structured certain relationships, right? And it's just kind of like, you know, how we are the knowledge makers and we go out, right? So it's important, and outreach is important, and service work is also highly important, but that's not what I'm trying to get to, right? And all of those kind of do definitely make research stronger and make research a lot richer, but that's not what it is, right? So what is it, right? And Jenny and everybody, if you guys were here and the previous talk, you know, the ethics that drive the research is kind of at the core of this, and it's what drives, at the end of the day, the methods. I situate myself within genealogies that come from the South. I'm from Mexico, and I was trained in Mexico within particular currents and thoughts and intellectual genealogies. And this really kind of informed me, right? Mexican anthropology at its core is one that has really been enmeshed with the state and its nation building projects. It's at the core of it. It's with at the core of national imaginaries and the construction of national imaginaries through distinct policies, including indigenista policies, who really viewed which anthropology is, you know, directly towards indigenous communities in Mexico for a very long time, still does. So it really kind of reached out as towards indigenous territories as sites of state intervention, right? Despite, and this is very problematic, and this is part of the history of Mexican anthropology, but at the same time, it was a discipline that constructed knowledge in terms of, it really was made to resolve social issues, even within a colonial framework, right? So I'm not dismissing that, but I'm just saying it really kind of allowed for the praxis, and the theory was not something that was divided. It was very much enmeshed together. So this really allowed a practice that had multiple. You had the dominant anthropologist that really was an indigenista kind of guided policy, but also many other ones that you know, conjoined with other emerging liberation struggles in Latin America, and allowed to rethink methods and articulations of how to produce knowledge, right, collectively. And we have multiple scholars that you all probably have heard of or are in deep conversation with, you know, Paula Freire, Orlando Juárez Borda in Colombia, Bonfil Batalla in Mexico, right, and whom viewed the production of knowledge departing from like going away from relations of coloniality, really making a point to steer away. So I really grabbed from those trajectories, right, that are so embedded in many of the scholars today in Latin America. And acompañamiento, accompanying, is kind of one of those, right? Accompanying as a method, right? Accompanying as your ethical framework that will guide how you engage with the different communities that you work with, or groups of people that you might work with. Orlando Fares-Borda, Colombian sociologist, developed action research methodologies that really aimed at building popular power from the ground up, and really used this these methods of workshops, right, to kind of have that dialectical construction of knowledge. So that's kind of, for me, kind of the center of it, and it was not that I had it so clearly in my head when I was studying in Mexico, but it's definitely it was embedded in the theory that we read. It was embedded in the practice that we did. So that was one part, and the second one was the liberation struggles and indigenous movements that emerged at the time that I was in undergrad. So I'm kind of going far, but it's partly of kind of the approach that I'm taking. And those allowed me to really think through, those really called into question the ways in which theory was being, knowledge was being constructed. And really centered the academy as the center of, and kind of dismantle those hierarchies, right? So I joined them, and I joined them in the process and the project of keeping in the framework of, and the tension of trying to decolonize those hierarchies. So my initial work was with the communities, Zapatistas communities in the southern, in the border, the south border of Mexico. And I initiated research there, as I initiated myself as a researcher, but I did not enter the space as a researcher. I entered as a solidarity worker, basically, with projects that were being put together by the communities on education, and autonomous education. So it was kind of the grounding, just thinking about how we do research with communities. Sometimes it really depends on how you enter those spaces, right? And in this case, with the Zapatistas, it was as a solidarity, ally, right? Also accompanying in the process of, building this new democracy, right? So that was kind of the first project that emerged out of my research kind of experience, and that has really informed me to date, and thinking about, the teachings of the communities in terms of, they guided the research completely. They had control of the research. We proposed, me and my colleague proposed, after several years of working in the communities, and we needed to finish our thesis. For our senior year, we proposed that we were very interested in thinking about their process. And they said, yes, sure, but let's think about what's important to us right now, right? So kind of mobilizing knowledge for these liberation movements. And what we agreed on was they needed the story of the communities to come out, right? They needed the stories of the communities in struggle and their relationship with the coffee plantations to be told, right? So that's what we did. We gathered the stories from the communities. They gathered the elders, and it was kind of, so it was a very collaborative process in that, although they guided it, right, and they somewhat kind of proposed the topic, which we were actually very interested in doing, and it was around what we were doing. We were kind of back and forth, but they had control over the research and the research protocols and how we were going to do it, and when and where. So it was important for me to go through that and understand the difference of the different entry points, right, in knowledge production. Now, this is a highly organized process, right, in a highly organized community. From there, I moved to other similar entry points, but not in the same way, right? So I entered my second kind of experience in terms of research, accompanying communities, accompanying as a method, and accompanying these liberation processes or autonomic processes was in Central Mexico with another organization. And I entered there as a researcher. I had been working in the area. And I asked permission because I knew of their process, organization process, and I thought it was really interesting. So I asked if I could enter, if I could do, if they would let me do research on their process of autonomy. And they said yes. Yeah, you know, they after checking who I was and if I was really an ally or not. I'd say yes, but this is going to be something that we decide how you're going to do, right? So there was a series of protocols for the research to take place. One that was I had to situate myself politically, right? So that meant not talking to non-Indigenous folks in the area who were their staunch enemies, right? Those were the ones that had dispossessed them of their lands, that had taken their lands. Two, I had to, give back, right? So it's a process of reciprocity was based on their local ways of organizing. I had to give back, and through mano vuelta, what it's called in the area, which is like giving back your hand with the translation. But it was, you give mano vuelta, and that means we're asking you to teach in the local autonomous high school. So I did that for several years as part of the reciprocal relation that we were building. And third, really thinking that I had to consult with the organization as I moved through the research, right? It wasn't a research that was built with them, as I said at the beginning. Ideally, that's the blueprint, but I didn't build it or design it with them. I had a research of topic, and they were kind of they want reports from me, right, to come back and see what I was doing. But with those three preconditions, I had to kind of keep myself always following those three preconditions. Oh my God, it's so late. So I'm gonna move very quick. So those are, the important kind of models that I followed. And one last thing within this slide that I wanted to kind of ground the research I do was the different models that are not only, I wanted to center a little bit the US and see at other models outside of the United States. And the rural development masters that I was engaged with was one that was really situating people that were engaged in social processes in the rural areas already, right? It was not about the GED or anything like that. It was about, are you inserted in a process, right? In a social process already. So we met 3 times, we met once a month. So my colleagues were basically agronomists, right? We had indigenous leaders, we had environmentalists, working with local forest keepers, right? And so all these different kinds of practitioners, we were practitioners that were on site. And we met once a week, and from 8 to 8 in the morning, 8 at night, and we just discuss the readings of the week. So it was a lot of reading. But it was great because then we had a discussion that was very grounded on the everyday, right? And I seek to follow that, and I seek to bring this as an example because I think it's important to think about alternative models that allow us to be more reciprocal with the knowledge making and the knowledge procedures. And now I'll move rapidly to my projects today. So part of my questions that I always depart from is knowledge for whom and for what purpose, right? Once we answer that, what are our responsibilities towards the people we engage and walk with? That was Zapatista communities, and I had a particular role. The same, had to answer those questions. With the Totonac in Central Mexico, the same, I had a different role. And my role at the end of the day in that research, second research in Central Mexico, was in creating research, not the decolonial one that I might be mapping out, but actually the one that they needed to establish an argument towards the state, right? So kind of like testimony of the work that they were doing to leverage with state resources, right? To leverage resources with the state. So, mobilizing research also for particular ends in terms of the political struggles that these people are doing. And that has become an important book that you saw earlier that really has to become kind of the argument of why these indigenous courts that I did my research on are important and why the state needs to continue their support, right? So very different from the initial research. And now I move to my third kind of side of research, and after learning a lot in a different location, different nation state, and a different also location as a professional, right, within the university. And I present these two researches, one that emanates also of my my engagement with the communities beyond the university, just as a community member, and understanding after 10 years of working with different organizations that serve migrants and migrant activists and activists themselves, and just activists myself, thinking about the production of knowledge, thinking about the different barriers and needs that were coming up frequently and that needed to be resolved somewhat urgently, right? And as part of that, thinking about the shift in the migrant communities in Champaign, and looking at because it was so rapid when indigenous Mayan migrants came to Champaign, like the shift in terms of numbers was very quick. It was very clear from what the organizations were talking about and what I was seeing that there was a problem in terms of communication, in terms of access to services. And for me, one of the main problems that I was seeing was the language barriers, language access, right? And all that came with it, right? And because it's not just about access, having an interpreter, it's about understanding the location of those communities here. So from the side that in a very non-organized side, is not like Mexico, also in a place where the anthropology has a very different role, right? But here in an institution that it moves differently, right? And in a community that's highly fragmented and mobile, right? It really required different types of questions, but still at the forefront, it was knowledge for whom and for what purpose, right? And in this case, I don't have a research project in this Mayan languages on the move in the strict sense of the word. I'm not doing any research on it. I'm actually just doing the process of accompanying, right? And for me, that is creating knowledge, maybe not in the more strict sense of the word of institutionalized knowledge production, but it's a production that is being done as we move in resolving the different problems that are emerging within the realm of language justice, right? So thinking with the different Mayan communities, Mayan members that have reached out and engaged in thinking about how do we resolve this problem of language. We have created this Pishanko of Interpreters Collective that really seeks to look at different ways of engaging, one, resolving a problem of language access internally, but also I think part of the what I'm trying to do here is, and what we're trying to do as a collective is trying to gear towards, it's not looking at the communities per se, right? And I'm trying to avoid very much when there's, in particular contexts, I think it's ethically dangerous, it's potentially dangerous to kind of like gear our gaze towards the communities, but rather gear our gaze to the structures, right? So working with hospitals, working with the schools, for me has been kind of the way of how do we resolve and how do we train. So we're training interpreters, but we're training schools to understand the language barriers and what those means to the particular migrant communities. I know I'm beyond my time and I am sorry. And the last is just, and this is just, again, an entry point, right? I enter and I'm not doing, again, institutionalized research in that particular sense, but rather creating knowledge that is resolving a particular need. And the third is the recent Rentoul community-based research project that is an interdisciplinary project with multiple people and colleagues from different disciplines, and thinking about responding to the health emergency. And this is a research project with all the IRB protocols and all the what you need to respond to, right? We need to respond to the health emergency and create data, right? That is grounded in community perspectives, right? So just thinking about the different entry points will really kind of allow you to enter certain knowledge making procedures. And it will guide kind of what kinds of methods you may need. And each one of the ones scenarios I presented require very different interventions, but at the core is how you ethically engage with them, right? And it's this, for me, my method is this process of accompanying, and as we move, then we see what's needed or not, or we're gonna engage in a co-creation of knowledge or not, right? Or if it's needed a testimony to the court to argue for indigenous courts, or is it creating data in relationship to health inequities? So those are kind of just as we engage. I think it's complicated. It's not a formula, and it's one that requires that we're always, I feel uncomfortable, that we're always asking, turning the gaze to ourselves and reflecting upon our practice with the different communities we speak and walk with.
Oh, thank you. That was beautiful and fantastic, and lots of resonance, I think, with some of the themes in Ruby's presentation as well. So if people, I think we can continue going. So if people have questions, we can address them, and then the video will be posted. So I'll keep an eye on the chat. But I did want to ask you, Cora, because I know that you do this pretty robustly. How do you incorporate undergraduate and graduate education into this process and into this method? Because I think that's something a lot of people may be trying to do.
They're accompanying, but I mean, a part of the idea, because I don't wanna, one of the things I'm trying to figure out, because we live in a university town, is how to doesn't become like populated by research projects, right, or like site of experimentation, right, but rather accompanying the social processes. So I frame it that way, and students have accompanied many of the community members to their different appointments, to their, just kind of following their needs and hoping to understand their every day, maybe commutings or language barriers. And that has been very rich, and I grabbed that from my own experience as an undergrad, as being integrated into a larger purpose, something that's larger than you. Your research becomes so much more tangible and so much more, it has a reason to be, right? So understanding, we're going to engage with the communities, trying to understand what are the needs and desires and potential collaborations requires accompanying, everything, really, just really accompanying the process of migration, right? I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah.
We have a methods class, and we have an ethics, a robust ethics before they accompany anything. And also we also do this in collaboration with organizations, local organizations. So engage with local organizations, and then they accompany the different things that the different organizations are doing. But usually it's along the lines of trying to understand and serve the community.
Fantastic. All right, and so you talked a little bit about how the kind of community needs and expectations drive your projects. And so one of the things that seems like to be the case based on the slide you had, right, is that the project is kind of always changing, so I was wondering if you could give it kind of like an overview of the types of projects, just in the sense of, you mentioned high schools, you mentioned hospitals, right, and you mentioned kind of providing material around information around COVID, right, in Concubal. And so I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about either the process or what it's like to kind of have a project that shifts somewhat rapidly, right?
Yeah. And I had a little video of what we have done, but I didn't have it. I was beyond my time, so. So I mean, what we've been doing is, I mean, the objective is to form community community knowledge producers, right? But along the lines of language justice, right? And also at the same time, trying to find a way that they can respond to the immediate need, which is the language interpretation, right? And this had become in doing materials. So we, with the students in my undergraduate classes and the interpreters were, and the YMCA, we were working on a guide for transportation on Canjobal, right? So that was kind of the initial, and we were working on the different ways that, you know, people might understand, might see a map and how they move around town, how they move to Chicago, the needs that they need in terms of transportation. That moved really quickly with COVID. And right now what we're doing is just responding to the health emergency. And we work with we often do works for the Champaign Health District in terms of responding to, you know, the information, passing down the information, because that's what's needed right now, right? And it's ongoing, right? So the only thing that as I say again, I feel I see myself as a practitioner, community practitioner. I don't have time at times to really think about the process. So I appreciate this space because we're just responding and responding and responding, right? And training the interpreters and trying to also make out of this something that the community can benefit from. So jobs, right? So they're training to get jobs. They have 3 people that are on jobs and constantly get some money back from the health department or from organizations. And it's very small. It's not, it's not at the level of Ruby, but it's definitely like a very grassroots little thing that tries to really respond to what the community needs at this point.
Wonderful. All right, I think we have time for another question. Can you give us an example of a challenge you've run into in any of these processes and kind of how you addressed it?
Challenges. The challenges are that communities shift and needs shift. So you might have at some point, you know, devise something together, and at that point, you know, especially part of, you know, kind of trying to situate the work here with the different communities, you know, the needs are so great that, you know, you have 10 people, but as long as we don't have the resources to support them, it just, you know, they need to go to work. Right? They always try to find resources to pay them as much as they can. They never work or do anything for the project that's not paid. But that resources are one, resources to pay them, but resources also to maintain a sustainable kind of process, right? That it's not just that little immediate one, which can help, but it's kind of building, and that was one of the things I needed to talk about, is just building the resources and building the infrastructure to really allow for community members to become knowledge producers, right? And that requires to have the resources for them to support and put the time, right? That we have. We get paid for that. They don't. So, I mean, they don't get in the same way, the same structures. That for me is the biggest challenge.
Sure. All right, I think we can do one more question. Then we had a question that I would love to pose to both you and Ruby. So we had a question about what you think might be the difference between acompañamiento and genuine volunteering, theoretical at a theoretical level or other, regarding folks who might describe what they do as volunteering to a community they care for and not necessarily consider it accompanying.
So what is the difference between kind of doing solidarity work and the volunteer work and acompañamiento?
Yeah,
I mean, I see it as acompañamiento. I see it as a long-term commitment to the communities that also might engage research, right, and co-constructing, you know, knowledge together. And it's a social kind of accompanying a social political process that you align with, right? Sometimes the volunteer work is fantastic, but it might not necessarily kind of gather that same level of commitment that I feel it requires a social process, right? A political process, right? Okay. That's the difference that I see.
Yeah. Okay. So, and for you, both you and Ruby, this is a question that came up earlier. So your work is with communities and kind of collaborative and across that level and organizations, but it also includes collaboration with other academics and researchers, right? Colleagues at the university or other universities. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what that process is like or looks like, or how it is interwoven or not into the other aspects of, collaboration and ethics that you've been talking about.
That's one near and dear to my heart, right? I think I have been almost all over this university. And I would say when I first started, it was with the genomics project. And I remember the head of Soc at the time, she said that she was going to put a map together of just kind of my travels through the different departments. And it was really interesting. I mean, first of all, it's very labor intensive to do that. And I know the university has since tried to figure out ways to let people know what others are doing. But it was also very fascinating. It's very fascinating to have an idea and to have a thought, and then to know you can go to someone on campus and that's their gift, genius. That's what they have done for the last 20 years. And they bring that powerhouse of knowledge to your project. To me, that has been one of the extraordinary things about the University of Illinois that I think I have benefited from tremendously. Like I said, with the computer science students, when they created the virtual reality, with the industrial fabrics, right? That's nothing that I have thought about until I saw it. And I was like, oh, the same thing with the big data project. I'm like, oh, right, I'm interested in food insecurity and poverty. What can those fabrics be used in this sense? So for me, it's really been, what do you want to do? What are you trying to do? And then to look for others. And then the more that people know about my research, they also reach out to me. So I would say for me, that's how it's been. But then I also want to say, and this is really important, even as I go to all of those departments, I'm really interested in how can community members have access to those departments, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of with the Nobel Project. We ask the young people, what's your gift, talent, dream? And we're going to layer computer science on top of that. But if it's sociology, if it's the arts, if it's other things, like we're going to those departments, right? Can you mentor? Do you have a pathway program? What resources do you have to support these parents and their young people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm much younger at that. I'm way behind, and I'm just learning. I feel that to understand the potency of the different collaborations in the university and learning the different departments, and and with this particular COVID project, that has been kind of my experience of learning how rich, right, one becomes in terms of understanding a problem when you have 10 people that think about it from very different perspectives, right? So I'm very new at that. Again, in terms of, I'm new at the university in general, so it's kind of just working through those and understanding how those works and the potential that those have for me, but also as Ruby says, for the communities, right?
And I would also say like that they take time too, because I remember in many meetings, right, we're not even talking the same language. And I remember one time I said something, I was like, yeah, so everybody knows this and that. And then the person came to me later and was like, you know what, like I did know that, but I was too, right, like I didn't want to raise my hand and say that. And I've been in the genomics meetings, right, and Gene would be good because he would say, okay, it's this, it's that. And I'm like, okay. And sometimes I'll raise my hand, but I didn't want to slow down the whole team. But it is this balance and this dance until you start to speak that one language, and others who haven't been in your field and thinking about it, they're giving you suggestions from your side. I love when that happens. So yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I am deeply grateful for everything you guys have shared with us today, and for the conversation that you're allowing us to have, that you've been having for a long time and are allowing us to have more broadly on campus. And so I just wanted to say, thank you for all of this, and it's been very rich and very exciting. And thanks to everyone who has been able to join us. The recording will be available. The link, it won't be up for a couple of days probably, or a week or two, but it will be available. And as I said, we are putting together a kind of bibliography of resources that people will be able to access. So the conversation continues. We will be having more events in the spring as well. So keep an eye out for that. And we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you at our next event. So thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.